You are now experiencing the digital life with Kevin Lockett.
Hey everybody, welcome to The Digital Life. Today I talk all things hip-hop with Matt Daniels from Polygraph and Kevin Beacham from Rhymesayers as I discuss their data-driven piece on the most successful labels in hip-hop. Now, one of the things I miss about the 90s are the stories about the record labels. From Death Row to Bad Boy, Def Jam, LaFace, Rockefeller, Cash Money, Rough Riders, the hip-hop labels back then were just as interesting as the artists themselves. And the most interesting thing about Matt and Kevin's research is that old school hip-hop labels like Jive and Coachillin were just as influential or even more so than Aftermath and Maybach Music. It's in my head. I keep on saying that all the time. Maybach Music. I had a great time talking to Matt and Kevin. And if you're a lover of hip-hop or a lover of data or both, you will certainly enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Matt Daniels and Kevin Beacham on the 500 most successful labels in hip-hop history.
Okay, we're talking to Matt Daniels and Kevin Beacham. How you guys doing today?
Doing great, man. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
No problem. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today because you guys compiled something that's near and dear to my heart, which is hip-hop. And first off, I want to congratulate you two because, you know, people talk about Nate Silver and 538 and all the stuff that he does, but I think you guys have done something that even Nate Silver could never do. It's just that in-depth and that interesting. So thank you both.
Well, thank you.
All right. So you wrote a piece, or you compiled a piece entitled The Most Successful Labels in Hip-Hop. And I really do think this should be made into a book because it feels like it's a companion piece to Dan Charnas's Big Payback. It seems like it's a nice companion to that because it's so in-depth about hip-hop, about labels, about music, about the history. So first of all, how did you two decide to put this together, and how long did it take?
So I mean, Kevin has like an immense amount of source material. I don't know, maybe you can speak to that, but the first part was just an individual at Rhymesayers reached out to me and was like, we have Kevin who knows more about hip hop than anyone he knows, and then I've been working on data stuff, so we just started shooting the breeze and thinking about what would be a cool idea to do together. So it's kind of like the first step.
Yeah, for sure. And then so from my end, I'm just a super history nerd when it comes to hip-hop. So I've been, for the last 15 years or so, just been compiling any kind of information and data I can on history of artists, history of labels, regions, and just compiling all the stuff into spreadsheets. Not even knowing what I was going to use it for. Have all these ideas of doing websites, writing books with this information, but being so much in love with the research part of it, just keep on researching and researching. So after seeing a few things that Matt had been doing, his largest vocabulary, data research, and different things he's been doing, I was like really intrigued by that. So when this opportunity came for us to collaborate, it seemed like a great thing to do. And of course, you've seen the anniversary of Def Jam just passed recently, and sort of that data that came out with that. And these different labels, and Rhymesayers having our 20-year anniversary now, and seeing how that's been going. We thought it would be interesting to look at just the history of labels in general.
And how long did the whole process take?
Oh, yeah. When did you start actually working on that, Matt,
Yeah, I would say like the whole thing probably took maybe like a month to pull together. I mean, it definitely spread out over a longer time period, but once we had all the data together, and we kind of hunkered down and figured out like what was the storyline. I would say like around that time period, yeah.
Yeah, probably like a month and a half, which I hadn't thought about that in a minute, which actually sounds kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it was the fact that Matt is working with material that he's familiar with. I'm working with material that I already have all this data, so it's really about us finding the time to get together and me present what I have, he present what he has, and let's make it make sense. So it wasn't really like we were starting from scratch by any means. So I think that really gave us the ability to move forward a little quickly.
So Matt, the map that you have online is really cool. Like I've never seen a map that moves around and shifts like that. What's the process of putting together a map like that? That's so interactive.
Yeah, I had never done anything like that before. So that was one of the reasons I was excited about the project. And by the way, this wasn't like a commission or anything like that. Like we just wanted to do something cool together. So I took this as an opportunity to just teach myself some new approaches to design that I hadn't done before. So yeah, that map is programming. It's code, and I've been doing that more and more aggressively over the past year. And doing something like that involves not only having some data around what labels are headquartered in what region, and then also compiling like the success of that label based on how well their tracks were charting in that year, and then visualizing that in a really compelling way. So the code that kind of drives that is this thing called D3, which is kind of like I'm trying to put it in layman's terms, but it almost makes it a lot easier to do visualization than as if you had to write it from scratch. So it's kind of like a helper in that way. And it was invented by this guy and started by this guy who worked at the New York Times. Mm-hmm. So he was doing journalism for the New York Times and was like, I want to do more interactive stuff. And I'm totally summarizing here. I'm sure there's way more detail to the story, but he created it to help himself write more visualized stories than they had been writing previously. So he opened it up to the public, and now all people all over the world, including myself, are using his tools.
That's something. So, Kevin, you basically said when you were compiling this information, there were some things that you knew without the data that rang true, and there were some things that you were surprised by. So what were things that rang true with you that the data supported, and what were some things that truly surprised you once you was compiling your analysis?
Basically, people, and no matter where you're entry point into hip-hop, everyone has their, hip-hop's a thing that people are very passionate about. So when you're involved in it, people tend to get very passionate and have these very strong opinions about things. And I'm sure I'm no different in that way. But my years of research have gotten me to get a little more, to use the data more than my emotion to make decisions on things, I would say. And so one thing that I think people get emotional about is a big debate about, and this is an ongoing thing, you hear it so many times about, back in the 80s it was the best time, or it was best in the 90s, or things were so much more diverse back then, or whatever. You hear these different arguments. So I kind of had this theory that this chart, particularly what we use, we use Billboard data for this project, and I was pretty sure that the data would support that today the charts are less diverse.
Right.
That, you have a more similar sound that makes it to the Billboard charts. Now, that does not mean that the music itself, overall, it's just that the diversity that's in hip-hop right now isn't necessarily reflected in the charts the way it was previously. And so I kind of suspected that would be true, but I hadn't really looked at, the last 10 years of data. My focus is mainly on, studying the 80s and 90s. So I was kind of cool to actually see the actual, here's what I would consider proof that that's true. Some of the things that I didn't expect were there was a couple of labels that I didn't who had, when you looked at those different years, and I did this a million times already, and I still do it to this, it's still interesting to me now. But when I go through, there's certain labels, when they have the biggest part of the pie, I was like, I would never suspected that label had the big, I knew Jive was big, but I guess I didn't think of Jive as, I always thought Def Jam was, such a huge thing. Or there was different labels. And I think part of it, looking at, at any given time, you never see, Ruthless with the biggest part of the pie. But I think about how big NWA and Eazy was. But, you think about how Ruthless was a part of, Atlantic, and some of the labels on artists on Ruthless, were through Relativity. So they were going through different labels for their distribution, and that affected how much they might have influence overall on the charts. So it was kind of interesting to see how how distribution deals and indie labels paired with distribution could affect their perception in history of how big they were or successful they were.
Yeah, Jive is an unsung label. Because, as the years go along, you hear about Judge Up and the Fresh Prince and Kumo D and Too Short, but you forget they were all under Jive.
Right.
Because people don't associate them with that label.
Right. Jive wasn't one of those labels that they weren't really good at marketing themselves as Jive. They were good at marketing their artists, but, you think Def Jam, you associate artists with Def Jam. And that's the thing. You know who's on Ruthless, but, I don't even think about, the Fresh Prince being on Jive. Like I just like the Fresh Prince made good music and he was popular, but he was on Jive. So it feels like they had a sort of a lack of label branding, I would say.
All right, Matt. Let me ask you a question. When you're putting together the data, and the data is fascinating. So Rough House was at number 8, and you forget how many great artists Rough House has. But then you look at Death Row, and Death Row was ranked, like in the 40s someplace, I forget. Like Death Row was, it was in the 40s someplace. Yeah, 44, 41. Death Row was at 41. Were you surprised when you were compiling the data that Death Row, which people know and love, for the most part, is so much lower than Rough House, which really doesn't get as much credit, but it had a lot of great artists as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is getting into the fact that we use Billboard data, right? So, the question is then, does Billboard reflect influence and cultural relevance, right? And in some ways it does. Like, these are the breakout artists are going to be charting really well, but just because you're a breakout artist doesn't mean that you dominate the charts. Like, I still see today that Drake has not had a number 1 hit yet, which is insane when you think about it in terms of like how big Hotline Bling was over the past week. And timing kind of sucks for him right now. But yeah, I mean, like, and that's just how the dynamics of charting work, in terms of how Billboard compiles the data and stuff like that. And the other thing is to think about just the eras in which some of these tracks are being released. So, and I want to make this point earlier, and we kind of moved over it, but a lot has changed in how music charts today versus 5 years ago versus 10 years ago. It's a lot easier for an artist to chart longer today than in the 90s, for example. Mm-hmm. And that has a lot to do with just the fact that, like, culture is, I think, converging more. Like, it's easier for someone to go mainstream today than it was before, just because we have the internet. And radio channels aren't dominating music listening habits like they used to. So there's just a lot going on. And one thing to consider is, like, where Aftermath was at that time of music. And then, again, like, who the other artists that were charting during that time as well. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. My head just basically goes to, like, what is the data set missing on knowing that Aftermath was so influential in that time period,
Yeah, I think, and just to kind of add to that, I think is, you think about just the kind of, artists on those different labels between Death Row and Rough House, who was successful and for what reasons, Rough House had Crisscross. That was a pop, that's a different kind of pop record. I mean, that's a traditional pop record. They had the Fugees, for a while there. So they had different groups that, like, were more universally fitted for radio, where Death Row, they were just making, you can't call them underground hits, but, they weren't getting radio play in the same way. Not right away. I mean, Snoop did get some radio play for sure, but that was like after some resistance, They were like, I remember I was working promotions at that time and part of it was radio, and, there was, they were struggling with playing Gin and Juice on the radio. So it took a while for them to be like, you know what, we can still make money off playing this music no matter what our moral belief is.
You're right, because I was in college radio during that point, and we were just playing the heck out of Death Row and Bad Boy and all that stuff, but we're college.
Right. Yeah, you probably weren't playing that much Crisscross.
Right. Yeah. Like, so the competing radio stations were playing, like, Crisscross and all that, which was fine, but I'm thinking back, like, like the R&B stations were not playing Tupac back then. Right. We were, so yeah, you're exactly right. I forgot all about that stuff. It's all
about this, like, it's a lot of, you got to use a lot of, when you're looking at all this stuff, these different data and different piece of information, and looking back through history, you can't forget how much of a role that this perception plays in it, and everything is not always, easily what it seems in terms of success, in terms of, how big or how small something was. It really depends on all these different factors that people don't always consider, because people, like I said, usually look at this information and only speak emotionally about their passion for hip-hop.
Right. So it seems like Young Money is the last of this era, being like a boutique-type label. because they seem to be the only indie-ish type label that's having a lot of hits on these specific charts. Now, you got guys doing different things and women doing different things with streaming, but for the most part, Young Money seems to be a last of an era.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true. I mean, like it's and that was one thing that surprised me, that I never really thought about like that and grouping those artists in the same way. So I was like, oh wow, when I saw that just the domination they've had for so long, I wasn't shocked. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but I hadn't thought about it. But at the same time, looking at that same time period and not seeing Odd Future on that chart, not seeing a lot of different other artists, I'm like, oh wow, like I can't find any really big charting Odd Future songs on this data.
Right.
That was strange to me. Like, when I think about how big they are. So I think we're just seeing, like what Matt was just saying, the difference of this era and how it's changed based on media, based on the fact that you become mainstream in a whole different way, and it also has changed in a certain degree what mainstream means. So I think I think Young Money is reflecting the new success, which is every bit as successful and important, as it was in the past. It's just different now, I think.
Future's interesting to me because his songs get played all the time. I mean, I'm okay with Future. I mean, he's all right for what he does. Yeah. But for the most part, you Run the Jewels, who aren't on mainstream radio, I saw them on Colbert, and then I saw Chance the Rapper. He's unsigned, and he's on Colbert. So the whole process of what's popular and what's not popular, and maybe the people that we hear on the radio aren't as popular as we think they are, and the people who are truly underground are the real popular ones at this point.
And that's kind of what I mean. It's so different. What mainstream means is, what does it even mean anymore?
Right. Right.
Because Run the Jewels could be considered mainstream in a certain sense. You know what I'm saying? Like, because they're on national TV, international TV, but they're it's getting a lot more harder to define what it means these days.
I think, like, on that mainstream, I just want to mention one thing is, like, the artists are having these huge hits. Like, there's a ton of marketing behind them. Like, The Weeknd, he's basically dominating the charts now. That's only after Republic decided to just throw a ton of marketing, and also producers that would create pop hits for him and work with him. So, like, not to discount those artists in any way, but, like, the money is not behind Odd Future, and nor would it be at any point in time. And the same thing with Run the Jewels, right? So it's just like there's a different marketing machine boosting these artists when you think about whether they're number one or not, or whether they're top 10. And that's what's reflected in the data on this project is just part of that marketing machine as well.
Matt, I got a question for you. I was looking at the 500s. Were you surprised by so many labels that you found that maybe had like one artist, one track, or one artist, two tracks?
Oh, I mean, not at all. Especially like early, if you go back earlier into the charts, like in the early 90s, predominantly. And we already touched on this. There was way more volatility in the chart. So you would have just more tracks charting, and again, we talked about this, more tracks charting in the 90s versus today. So you had just the opportunity for a label to get what seemed to be like a high degree of radio play, even if they were small and out of the middle of nowhere and just had one artist signed to them. And then they would just drop off the chart like a week later. So I think that was more of a function of like the time, the era of hip hop when Billboard was running this data versus today, which I think you see a lot more rarely. Yeah,
I think you have to look at comparably, like, that the early 90s and that 89, early 90s up until around 95, 96. That's pretty much the Wild West of of this data. Like, there was no rules. People, like I said, people just pop up for a quick instant. As I was looking through, I see a few things on that chart. And records that I have, because I was buying like everything, right? The most underground to the most pop, or I was getting it for free from being on the radio. But I was getting this stuff. And there's a few things I saw on the Billboard chart. I was like, there's no way that legitimately charted. I'm a fan of that song, but no one knows that song. But like, it was just the Wild West. So it's like, it doesn't make the data, tainted or anything. It's just that it was just like people at radio, which willing to try. They didn't understand what was going to work for rap or not, because it was confusing. Because you had Crisscross and you had Tupac with hits, So they were like, what extreme do we want to go? So they were trying everything, and then you had like when Bad Boy came in, that helped kind of define things, but it still was adding to the confusion because now you had Bad Boy, East Coast label, doing West Coast influenced music that was street oriented with the commercial feel. It's such a crazy formula, but it's a perfect formula.
I don't think Combs really get enough. I don't think he really gets enough credit for what he did as a label president. Like no, because like with Def Jam, you needed Russell and you needed Rick. You needed both of them. Def Jam wouldn't have survived if it was just one or the other.
It was way different. I don't think it would be what we know it as.
Right. But with Combs, he was basically Rick and he was Russell. And he just pushed the culture along. I think because he's been so successful in so many different things, I don't think he gets enough credit for what he did by straddling pop and street.
No, he doesn't. And that was key. I mean, and you still see the effects of that today.
Right. And also, Kevin, I want to thank you for actually writing about MC Hammer in this. It's a detailed analysis, so you as a whole. But I want to thank you for writing about MC Hammer because I think sometimes people kind of look over at MC Hammer and his influence. I mean, he did kind of poppy dance type stuff. Right. But he was important to the culture.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I remember the first time I heard MC Hammer, and it was like this is before he was he was underground at this point. I bought his record at like the mall, Tower Records, something like that, at the mall. And I didn't love it, but I didn't dislike it. I found 2 songs on that record that I liked, Feel the Power, and I forgot the other one, a DJ song about his DJ scratching. Right. And he was doing like battle raps. He was dissing Black Sheep, So I was like, it's not that's the thing, I think right now we're at a time where we're seeing the youth, the new generation, who has a more of an open mind to what they listen to in many ways. Back then, when Hammer came out and got big, that was the time of the Keep It Real movement.
Right.
Where it was like, anything that was mainstream was horrible until that person became mainstream was okay with it, But like, right. It was like really a time of like this divide. It wasn't like it was one part real emotion and passion, and another part sort of it was contrived in a way. Like, oh, it's cool to be against the mainstream, but I'm against it, And so it was cool to diss Hammer, There was no reason to diss Hammer. Like, he wasn't bothering anyone.
No, he wasn't. Like, he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he was. And here's the thing, and this is what I think is important, and I don't think I touched on it heavy enough in this when I wrote, is that people like to always talk about, Hammer ruined hip hop or Vanilla Ice ruined hip hop, but when you look at the data, all those things that pretty much everything that anyone's ever said has ruined hip hop actually helped hip hop grow. You think about all the time I ask artists about their entry point into hip hop. What was your first thing you got into? It's rarely is it like the most coolest thing they got into first. People got into MC Hammer to discover hip hop, but then learned about the other side of it and became, I don't want to give names. I don't know for sure who got influenced by MC Hammer, but I'm sure I will guarantee you there's a rapper right now who's doing big things, who's well respected, who was a Hammer fan as a kid.
Right.
Wasn't it Vince Staples did an interview about how he was a fan of Little Bow Wow? He was in elementary school or something,
Right.
So I'm sure Hammer and Criss Cross influenced this generation of great rappers today.
Right, exactly. Matt, so as with sports, you hear more about analytics and how teams are using analytics to find players and scout. How do you think analytics and data is going to affect rappers now and in the future?
I mean, it does and will more. So there's never been a time where we've had more data to make decisions about where to play or who's listening to your music or like what track did best or there's just like infinite possibilities. So and this is the world. This is everything. It's, like you said, it's sports, it's music, it's movies, it's all media, it's all culture. So I know a lot of the large record labels are beating up their data chops and Spotify is absolutely helping them. They're making a big investment in analyzing all the data they're getting off of streaming that they otherwise weren't getting with just album sale data.
Right. And Kevin, let me flip it around for you. So for more labels and more artists paying attention to analytics and data, can that hurt the artistry of hip hop at the same time?
Oh, I think you have to be careful with it. I mean, like, I think if you're an artist and you start looking at too much data, it really depends. Some people can look at these things and not affect them. It depends on where you're at mentally. But yeah, I do agree that if you get caught up in looking at data and start making moves following some of this data, in terms of making the music you make, I think that can. I mean, this is maybe not quite the same thing, but I think that might be where we got to with what I was saying about how the charts now are less diverse. I think people did see the continual success of like Bad Boy, which was a formula. So data, you can form formulas based on data. So I think now that we have more concise data, it could be dangerous if people use it to, not dangerous, but dangerous. But it could be detrimental perhaps to the diversity of the music if people use this data to determine what music they make or how they make music or how they chase charts. I do believe that. But I think there's much more of a chance for it to be useful, because you can use it for so many things like Matt was just saying. So I mean, like, as working for Rhymesayers, we are super intrigued by the data you can get these days. And we're talking about data all the time. And I don't think we've let it lead us down an evil path quite yet.
Right. Okay, so what's next, fellas?
Matt, what you got next?
What I got next? Yeah, I should talk with you guys about what's next. Yeah, I'm just doing more stuff. I should have a punk music project coming out soon. So I'm getting as smart about punk music as I can. And, it's doing more stuff. I'm trying to create an audience for more thoughtful storytelling that is not necessarily data-driven, but is more visual than the typical prose-driven stories that you see in articles and magazines and music websites. So it's just a different type of style I'm going for, and I just want to do more of that.
As for me, my biggest thing is I'm in probably the last stage of completing my first book.
Oh, okay.
I'm writing a book called Microphone Mathematics that is analytical look at the songwriting in hip-hop, the 70s and the 80s particularly. Just how MCing evolved and, like the history of the punchline, the history of storytelling, the history of conscious rap, the history of gangster rap, and just going through his real deep analytics and explaining how those things evolved. So, yeah.
Man, that's hardcore.
Thank you.
I want to thank you both for my party question that I'm going to use, and that was the first song to be number one on Billboard's Hot Rap Songs chart. And I don't think anybody would get it. I don't think anybody would get it, because I think those are like Tone Loc, Young MC. They would never get this song.
Yes, I know, right? That's a good one. It caught me off guard, too.
It did. I'm not sure I'm not even going to say it on the show. I'm not even going to say it. I'm going to make people guess.
That's a good one. That's a good question to ask when I hit them with.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. People need to check both of you out. Where can they go?
I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Kevin Beacham, Beacham 21, pretty much all across the board. So that's me.
And Matt?
Yeah, you can find my personal stuff at mdaniels, Matthew, Daniels.com.
All right. And the project that they worked on was the most successful labels in hip-hop. I do want to have one final question. Is there a label that you have more respect now after the research?
I don't know if I would say more respect. I guess in a certain sense. I'm still going back to my Jive comment for me. Okay. Looking at Jive. So I give them more credit now, but I also give them more criticism for not being better at branding. So kind of both sides of the coin. And then I have a newfound different kind of respect for Young Money now.
Is that good or bad?
For me?
Yeah.
It's good what they're achieving.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Young Money. I was thinking about Cash Money.
Young Money.
I'm thinking about how that's going to shake out eventually with Wayne and Baby.
Oh yeah, that's good. That's a whole different thing.
I don't want to get shot. Allegedly. And Matt, is there a label that you have more respect for now, or
Yeah, I wouldn't call it respect. I mean, my knowledge on labels was way more shallow than Kevin's or yours. I mean, I definitely felt like I had a good knowledge around hip hop, but like doing this label project just expanded it dramatically. So it was more just learning about the labels that wouldn't necessarily like dominate headlines. Like Slip and Slide out of Miami was like a big aha in terms of like their role in the music coming out of that region in hip hop. So stuff like that was probably more interesting to me, just seeing those labels and their role over the last decade and understanding a little bit more about them.
All right. Thanks a lot, fellas.
Thanks for having us, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem.
All right.
Thank you.
Peace.
I want to thank Matt Daniels from Polygraph and Kevin Beacham from Rhymesayers for the great discussion on the Digital Life. Make sure you check out the insightful conversation on the most successful labels in hip-hop and Polygraph. It's poly-graph.co. That's poly-graph.co. Before I go, I have a Twitter question for you. Tweet me at Kevin Lockett and tell me your favorite hip-hop label of all time. Or as Kanye would say, of all time. Use the hashtag DigitalKev. That's the hashtag DigitalKev. And tell me your favorite hip-hop label of all time, Sway. All right, everybody. It's the Digital Life. I'm Kevin Lockett, and I'm out. I'm out, Sway. How, Sway?
The Digital Life with Kevin Lockett. Lockett.